Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take these really complex systems, these ethical tangles, and we try to break them down into what you actually need to know to be truly well-informed.
Exactly.
And today, we are turning our focus inward. We're looking at one of the most contentious and widely used mechanisms in American education.
Standardized testing.
Standardized testing. Our sources, we've got a stack of academic research, professional standards, student testimonials. They reveal not just a measurement tool, but really an ethical double-edged sword.
That's a great way to put it.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We really want to move past the usual, the surface level debates about test scores. Are they going up? Are they going down?
Right. The horse race of it all.
Exactly. And instead, we're going to analyze the fundamental ethical contradictions that just seem to pop up when we use these high-stakes standardized tests as the main way to measure success.
The primary metric. That's the key.
And when we talk about the scale of this, we're not just talking about one big test at the end of the year. We are talking about an absolute avalanche of acronyms. We saw one report where a student said they took over 60 standardized tests during their 4 years in high school.
It's unbelievable.
Just think about that volume. You've got the PSAT, the SAT, NAEP, AP exams, STAR, all the state-mandated subject tests. It's an overwhelming amount of time and resources.
And that volume you're talking about, that's precisely where the ethical tension really starts, because we have to kind of distinguish between these tests to see the cumulative impact.
Okay.
So you mentioned the PSAT and SAT. Those are, generally summative. They're high-stakes college entrance exams.
Right. The big ones everyone knows.
The big ones. But then you have something like NAEP, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's often not even diagnostic for the student who takes it. It's really for providing these huge national benchmarks for policymakers.
So the student is just a data point for a bigger study, in a way.
In a way, yes. And then at the local level, you have systems that rely so heavily on these adaptive diagnostic tools like STAR testing.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating here is that the people who work in education measurement, the experts who design these tools, they're often the first to recognize the risk of this assessment overload.
So they see the problem that they're a part of.
They do. The critical question being posed by experts today is, what is the cumulative usefulness of all this? And maybe more importantly, what is the aggregated potential harm of making students navigate this maze of high-stakes assessment?
And it seems like when we look at that usefulness, that utility, we almost always focus exclusively on the final number, the score.
Exactly. We have to look beyond just numbers and think about all the critical context that a test score, by its nature, just obscures.
What do you mean by that?
Think about what a single score doesn't capture. It doesn't tell you if the student was operating on, say, 3 hours of sleep because they were up with a sick sibling.
Or dealing with a family crisis.
Or just having a profoundly bad day. It doesn't tell you if they were emotionally regulated enough to really apply their knowledge, or if they truly tried their hardest, or if they just bubbled in C for the last 20 questions because they ran out of time, or frankly, just motivation.
That's a huge variable.
It's huge. And maybe most critically, it hides these systemic and personal challenges. A score can look low, but it doesn't reveal whether that student is maybe a highly talented, deep conceptual thinker who also happens to be a first-generation American and struggles specifically with subtle language idioms.
Things that are culturally specific.
Exactly. Culturally specific vocabulary that's often embedded in the testing material. The score just says, needs improvement in reading comprehension. It doesn't say why.
So you have this massive tension right at the core of the whole system. On one side, you've got the system's goal, which it sounds noble.
It does.
Accountability, program evaluation, allocating resources, making sure taxpayer money is being spent effectively, measuring student progress on a national scale. These are all laudable, important aims for a modern society.
Of course.
But then on the other side, you have this devastating on-the-ground reality that's experienced by millions of students and teachers. You have profound student anxiety, you have documented systemic bias, which we're definitely going to get into, and a compromised educational quality.
That curriculum narrowing you mentioned?
Yeah, driven by the relentless cycle of the testing calendar.
Yeah.
So that core conflict between the idea of accountability and the reality of, integrity, that's the heart of what we're unpacking today.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the people who are bearing the immediate daily cost of this whole system, the students themselves. When you look at student accounts of the testing experience, the psychological toll, It moves so far beyond just simple test pressure. It becomes this chronic source of stress and, well, feelings of inadequacy.
It's not just performance anxiety. The sources describe it as a kind of systemic emotional exhaustion. I was particularly struck by an anecdote from one student panelist who was describing their physical preparation for the SAT.
Good.
They weren't prepping with flashcards the night before. They were preparing for their own body to sabotage them.
What do you mean?
They packed a second T-shirt
That's a second T-shirt.
and a stick of deodorant in their backpack.
Yeah.
They fully expected to need a mid-test break because they knew they were going to be sitting there in their own anxiety-induced sweat.
Wow. That's such a visceral image.
It is. That physiological response, just knowing your body is going to betray you under pressure, it really illustrates just how deeply toxic this environment can be. The internal struggle is immense, and it leads directly to that collective feeling that the students described. They said, there's an air of not good enough.
That's a powerful and heartbreaking image. It really illustrates how the system can kind of weaponize a student's own body against them. I mean, if you're spending that much cognitive and emotional energy just managing panic,
You have nothing left.
you have virtually nothing left for the complex problem solving the test is supposed to be measuring in the first place.
Exactly. Anxiety is the enemy of sustained, deep performance. But, stepping back for a moment, beyond that emotional toll, these tests often fail completely to foster any kind of intrinsic motivation in the students.
Why is that?
Because the students perceive this deep fundamental disconnect between what is being tested and what they truly value for their own future careers and passions.
They don't see the point.
They don't see the point. Students consistently argue that these standardized metrics don't measure the skills they will actually need in the 21st century workforce. You know, think about the student who was actively pursuing a career needing complex skills like 3D modeling, advanced software literacy. He was lamenting that the high-stakes test was asking him to just memorize a list of U.S. presidents, many of whom are, completely irrelevant to his chosen career path.
Okay, but hold on. Let me push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
Doesn't civic knowledge, history, a shared cultural narrative, doesn't that remain essential even for a 3D modeler?
Yeah.
Shouldn't we expect some kind of generalized knowledge as a baseline for any educated citizen?
And that is the crucial counterpoint. It's the nuance the students themselves address. They don't reject knowledge. They reject arbitrary knowledge being the sole metric for their intelligence or their future potential. They're highly motivated by purpose. So if you feel like you are being asked to jump through these arbitrary hoops, memorize a list of presidents for a score, you'll probably never even see the motivation to engage. Just it drops to zero.
It becomes about compliance, not learning.
Precisely. However, the source material also has this really valuable counterexample. It shows the empowering effect of background knowledge when it's relevant. One student, reflecting on an SAT reading passage about marine biology, shared that even though he wasn't passionate about the subject, he had grown up living near the coast in Rhode Island.
So he had context.
He had intrinsic knowledge, as he called it, an intuitive familiarity with marine ecosystems. And that background capital was immediately reflected in higher test scores for that specific section. He saw a direct correlation. He performed better on things he had context for and enjoyed, and much worse on generalized topics that felt totally abstract.
That observation is really critical because if deep knowledge of your local environment, in this case marine biology, is empowering, then can standardized testing truly function as a universal, equitable metric for intelligence?
Right.
Given the vast differences in students' home lives, their cultures, their community exposure. I mean, a child from rural Kansas isn't going to have the same intrinsic knowledge of marine biology as a child from Rhode Island.
And that's the student's argument, compellingly so. That generalized knowledge shouldn't be the sole metric. To overcome this inequity and foster real engagement, the students felt they needed this idea of purpose.
More transparent?
So much more transparency. They advocated for more explanation about who administers the test. Is this for the state? Is it for my school, for my college application? And critically, what exactly is the data used for? If they understood the mechanism and the benefit, they felt they would foster curiosity and engagement rather than just reluctant compliance.
And that desire for transparency, that leads directly into the next ethical issue, right?
Yeah.
Which is the frequent surprise, the moving goalposts, and just this fundamental lack of respect for the students' time and effort.
Yes.
Students reported frequently coming to school and just being met with little or no prior notice. They just walk in and the teacher announces, okay, Today we're taking the STAR test.
Ambushed by assessment.
Right. The student from that anecdote noted he didn't even know what the STAR assessment was his freshman year, just that he had to sit there for an hour and do it. And even when there was notice, the ethical inconsistency was palpable, especially for the younger kids. A student recollected their elementary school experience. Initially, the teachers de-emphasized the test, saying, "Oh, don't worry, they're not important."
Which, of course.
Which logically led the fifth graders not to care or truly try. But then, as the test date got closer, the pressure dramatically increased. It eventually shifted to these punitive measures.
The messaging changed completely.
Completely. The instruction suddenly became, if you don't try, you will be punished. And that sudden shift, especially for a 10-year-old who's just trying to understand the rules of their social environment, it's fundamentally confusing and unfair.
That punitive shift just breaks the foundational trust between the student and the teacher. It ensures that the motivation is purely external, it's fear-driven, and it completely defeats any long-term educational purpose of assessment, which really should be diagnostic and supportive. And that transition from external motivation, the fear of punishment, it logically leads to the second major problem in the student experience: the broken feedback loop.
The broken feedback loop.
If the test is purely compliance-based and the results are never returned to you, why would a student ever internally reflect on their own performance?
It's the ultimate ethical disconnect. You're forced to perform, but you never get to benefit from the result of that performance.
Exactly. Students rarely see their actual scores after elementary school, and when they do get feedback, it's often so vague, it's practically meaningless, like, being told they scored in the high green range.
High green? What does that even mean? That tells them nothing actionable about why they missed the geometry questions or how they misinterpreted the persuasive essay prompt.
Nothing. One student summarized the consequences just perfectly. They said, "I never get my results. I don't feel an implication in my learning. Nothing really changes with my answers." This lack of reflection is so consequential for things like self-efficacy and metacognition, thinking about your own thinking.
The ability to self-correct.
Yes. Another student pointed out that if they know they'll be able to discuss their answers, say, after analyzing a poem in English class, they feel a real internal motivation to think deeply during the assignment because the thought process actually matters.
Of course.
But if you never see the results of a standardized test, and you can't reflect on the thinking that led you to those answers, the internal quality of the thought that goes into it feels completely inconsequential to your own learning path. The ethical responsibility to inform the test taker is just. It's completely severed in practice.
So if the students are experiencing this emotional and motivational tax, what's happening on the other side of the desk with the teachers?
Well, the teachers are experiencing a powerful ethical squeeze. They are placed right in the middle of these high-stakes decisions, and they're often forced to make compromises that, frankly, violate their professional training.
The core ethical conflict for them, then, is navigating these two competing professional responsibilities, right?
That's it, exactly. First, their responsibility to provide a rich, quality education that truly reflects their content knowledge and their pedagogical training.
What they were taught to do.
What they know is best for kids. And second, the institutional pressure to prepare students specifically for these mandated assessments that are tied directly to accountability expectations.
To funding, to job security.
Exactly. And when those two responsibilities conflict, the accountability pressure almost always wins.
It has to.
It does. And this tension inevitably warps the classroom environment. The sources detail this really consistent pattern where high-stakes testing dictates curriculum content and delivery, forcing teachers to abandon effective, broad teaching strategies. It's a literal narrowing effect. It just cuts out everything that's considered non-essential to the test score.
That see this laid bare in that striking quote from one teacher who's referred to as Mr. James in the sources, talking about the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills, the TAKS test. He admitted, and I'm quoting here, "If I am not reviewing for the TAKS, my lesson is 90–95% TEKS material until the TAKS ends."
90 to 95%.
I mean, that statement just confirms the fundamental problem. For a huge portion of the academic year, the curriculum isn't driven by broad educational standards or student interest. It's driven solely by the test material.
So what happens to that 5 or 10% that gets cut?
That's the question.
The narrowing effect is devastating to educational quality. Teachers neglect critical instruction that builds genuine transferable skills. For instance, in social studies or English, they often stop integrating literature, deep historical contexts, or cross-curricular projects.
Because that material might not be explicitly translated into a multiple choice question.
Exactly. And what's often lost is the opportunity for these student-centered pedagogical practices. Things like project-based learning, which involves applying knowledge to complex open-ended problems or collaborative work or philosophical debate.
The things that build deeper skills.
The things that build critical thinking. But they all require time. And when the clock is ticking toward that high-stakes test, those activities are the first to be sacrificed for what they call content coverage.
So if teachers are anxious about content coverage, how does that anxiety impact how they teach? I mean, the specific pedagogy.
Well, the anxiety over covering content quickly leads to this critical shift away from effective teaching and toward pure test preparation strategies. Teachers report being inclined toward the fastest methods available. Lecturing, rapid coverage of facts, and spending huge amounts of class time just solving practice multiple choice tests. They're often focusing on test-taking tricks rather than actual conceptual mastery.
Right. Look for these keywords. Eliminate these two answers immediately.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this approach leads to a disregard for individual student differences and critically, it leads to the neglect of teaching embedded values. For example, many modern mathematics programs explicitly aim to teach values like persistence, collaboration, logical verification, right alongside the equations. But the high-stakes pressure causes teachers to ignore those non-tested ethical and behavioral elements entirely. Sound pedagogy teaching for deep, transferable understanding, it just takes a backseat to speed and coverage.
And this isn't just happening in, say, 11th grade where the big state test is, right? This trickles down.
Not at all. The sources show the pressure spreads down the pipeline. So teachers in lower grades, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, are adopting this test-oriented traditional instruction to prepare students early. It creates a testing culture that begins long before the assessment actually matters for graduation or promotion.
So it ensures the ethical damage is widespread and perpetual.
That's a good way to put it.
And when the institutional stakes get this high, with funding, job security, school ratings all on the line, the risks around academic integrity they skyrocket.
Yeah.
This moves us from just curriculum narrowing to outright unethical practices.
Right.
Practices often masked by the desperation to meet those metrics. The sources highlight what is often referred to as assisted cheating.
And that's a really important term. It occurs when teachers or administrators compromise integrity, not necessarily for the student's personal benefit, but to improve the class metrics needed to secure funding or high school ratings.
So the pressure is on the adults to produce a score.
Exactly. Not on the students to produce genuine learning. And this is a major area of ethical concern cited in all the professional standards.
What's the definition there?
The definition of unethical practices in assessment is very clear, and it's designed to protect the integrity of the data. It includes things like providing students with actual test questions beforehand.
Wow.
Changing instruction or reviewing specific concepts immediately after viewing the test material, or, during the administration itself, rewording or clarifying questions beyond the approved script.
And what's the most egregious violation of trust in that list?
The most egregious is, without a doubt, returning a student's answer document and prompting or suggesting that the student should change their answers.
With a little nod or a wink.
Often with nonverbal cues. This is a deliberate manipulation of the outcome that makes the resulting score completely invalid for measuring that student's true ability. It violates the core ethical duty of the educator, which is to foster genuine growth, not faked compliance.
This brings us to the formal professional standards of practice that are supposed to govern this entire assessment enterprise. Because it's not like the testing world is unregulated, right?
Not at all.
There are extensive professional guidelines, like the Code of Fair Testing Practices in Education developed by these major organizations, American Educational Research Association, the APA, the National Council on Measurement in Education.
Yeah, ARRA, APA, and NCME, yeah.
So these codes are designed to ensure fairness, validity, appropriate use. They outline clear responsibilities for both the people who develop the tests and the people who use them across 4 key areas: selecting them, administering them, reporting on them, and critically informing the test takers.
And stepping back for a moment, these standards really represent the ethical bedrock of assessment. For example, test developers have this rigorous ethical expectation regarding validity and fairness. They must, and I'm quoting here, evaluate the evidence to ensure that differences in performance are related only to the skills being assessed.
Only to the skills.
And consciously design the test to exclude any performance differences caused by unrelated factors. So this means if a student scores low, the developers have to prove it's because the student lacks mathematical ability, not because the questions were phrased in some confusing cultural context or used obscure language.
So they're ethically bound to filter out bias.
They are.
And what about the users of the test? The schools, the districts, what are their ethical obligations?
Well, the test users, the administrators, counselors, teachers, they must clearly define the purpose of the testing before they administer it. And they have to select only appropriate tests based on a thorough review of their known limitations and strengths. They can't just use any assessment they find convenient.
And here is where the paradox becomes just glaring. The professional bodies who write the standards seem to explicitly contradict modern high-stakes policy.
That's the disconnect. It's a huge one. A core ethical principle asserted by these experts is that the reliance on a single indicator like one standardized test score to make significant decisions.
Like whether you graduate.
Exactly. Decisions regarding learning, tracking, promotion, or graduation, that violates the fundamental ethics of teaching and measurement.
It violates the ethics.
Because good measurement requires multiple data points and multiple methods. Using one score to label a student's entire competency is, by their definition, an unethical simplification.
So the system itself, the way most states structure high-stakes accountability, is often functioning entirely outside the ethical guidelines established by the professional bodies that study testing. That's a serious indictment.
It is. And we can measure precisely how current practice fails these established standards, particularly when it comes to communicating results.
How so?
Well, the Code of Fair Testing Practices is crystal clear. Test users must inform test takers about the nature of the test, their rights, and the appropriate use of scores.
Right.
Yet, the student experiences we just discussed, the surprise tests, the shifting goalposts, the total lack of explanation show this is consistently lacking right across the board.
And the timeliness of results is also a documented failure against the code.
Absolutely. The code demands that results be communicated in a timely fashion and in a manner that is understood by the test taker.
Which is a direct, measurable contradiction of what students report.
It's a direct contradiction of students saying scores are often unavailable after elementary school or only provided vaguely as high green months after the testing date. If the score comes back too late, it loses all diagnostic value. It can't inform instruction. It can only be used for punishment or for policy review.
Beyond the general fairness guidelines, the sources also talk about the ethics of the testing material itself, the physical instruments. Why does it matter if a test is, say, 10 or 15 years old?
Oh, it matters greatly because human populations, language, and knowledge norms, they change so rapidly. Professional bodies like the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHO, require using instrumentation that's consistent with accepted professional guidelines.
So you have to use up-to-date tests.
You have to use up-to-date tests, and here's why. Newer editions of standardized tests reflect new norms, cultural shifts, and information relevant to the current student population. Using an older version of an assessment, maybe because it's cheaper or just easier to administer, that's a real ethical dilemma because those original norms may no longer be accurate. And this could potentially misrepresent a student's true abilities or deficits, leading to completely inappropriate instructional or placement decisions based on outdated data. The ethical obligation is to use the most accurate, relevant tool available.
So here's where we move from institutional failure to, I think, the deepest level of critique. The systemic and philosophical problems of measurement itself.
Right.
When you look at standardized testing from a sociological perspective, many critics argue that it doesn't serve as a neutral, objective measure of innate ability. Instead, they argue it acts as a powerful mechanism for social stratification.
Yeah.
It reinforces existing inequalities, economic, social, cultural, instead of genuinely promoting a true meritocracy where, effort and innate talent are what prevail.
And this critique is heavily influenced by the work of the theorist Pierre Bourdieu and his concept of cultural capital. We really need to understand this concept fully to get the critique.
Okay, break it down for us.
Cultural capital describes the knowledge, the skills, the habits, the tastes, the linguistic competency that are valued and transmitted by the dominant culture, which in our society tends to be middle to upper class, white, and educated.
Right.
And standardized test content aligns very, very closely with this dominant cultural capital. Students from privileged backgrounds simply possess this knowledge. from family conversations, summer travel, access to specific media or books that is more likely to be reflected in the test questions.
So it gives them an inherent built-in advantage.
A huge advantage that is completely unrelated to their raw, innate intelligence or their ability to learn. They are scoring high on things they absorb passively, not necessarily things they struggled to master.
And that structural advantage, that leads directly to what's known as assessment bias. What are the most insidious ways this bias shows up linguistically?
Oh, the linguistic bias can be particularly damaging. We need to look closely at tests given to what are called bidialectal speakers.
Bidialectal.
That is, students who are fluent in both a non-standard dialect, like African American vernacular English or a specific regional patois, and also standard English.
Okay.
Often, tests require these students to distinguish between subtle phonetic differences or homonyms that might sound identical in their everyday oral speech patterns. For example, distinguishing had from hat or right from rat. In their home or their community, these sounds might be used interchangeably, or the phonetic difference is negligible. Being forced to distinguish them, removed from a real communicative situation where context would clarify the meaning. It just burns cognitive energy and places them at a major disadvantage compared to native standard English speakers who hear those distinctions constantly.
So the test isn't measuring their ability to comprehend or
Yeah.
communicate.
No.
It's measuring their conformity to a specific, privileged phonetic system.
Precisely. It is turning an intellectual and cultural asset, the ability to operate successfully in two different linguistic spheres, into a perceived deficit on a test.
And culturally, the bias seems to appear when the questions assume a shared set of experiences or values that not all students possess.
Yes, cultural bias appears powerfully in vocabulary or analogy questions. The source material offers an excellent example, a vocabulary subtest asking students to select the best synonym for inequality. And the list includes absence, foreign, difference, similarity, poor. Critics point out that in communities with chronic negative experiences of systemic inequality, a student might reasonably choose difference or poor, since those concepts are intrinsically linked to the experience of inequality in real life.
That makes perfect sense from their lived experience.
It's perfectly reasonable. However, the test demands only one specific arbitrary correct synonym, which was probably selected by linguists or item writers with no personal experience of that inequality. So if the student selects a perfectly reasonable synonym based on their lived experience, they are marked wrong. This is the definition of a cultural filter.
And beyond the content, there's even bias just in the act of testing itself.
That's what's so often overlooked. The cultural bias inherent in the testing situation. Research indicates that in many working-class Black communities, for instance, children are rarely asked test-type questions.
What's a test-type question?
It means a question to which the adult already knows the answer. This is because stating the obvious is seen as communicatively meaningless or sometimes even disrespectful in that specific cultural context.
Interesting.
So for many working class and minority students, the entire testing situation, sitting silently, responding to questions whose answers are self-evident to the adults, it violates these deeply held cultural assumptions about what meaningful communication even is.
So it compounds the stress.
It compounds the stress, the unfamiliarity, the cognitive load. They are not just taking a test, they are navigating an alien cultural ritual.
This leads us to the most fundamental philosophical critique, which shifts the discussion beyond bias and into the nature of measurement validity itself. The core argument here is that standardized tests primarily measure effects, not underlying causes.
That's a critical distinction.
So if we define an effect as the capacity to produce a desired outcome, like a high score, and a cause as raw intelligence, deep learning, or true mastery, then the test can be easily gamed because the system standardizes the effect.
And the philosophical example provided in the sources illustrates the profound consequence of this standardization.
Gross's example.
A rose's example. Consider two individuals presenting roses to their spouse. The devoted husband brings flowers to express sincere love, that's the noble cause. But the unfaithful scoundrel might present the exact same roses, bought from the same florist, to conceal infidelity, a very different cause.
Right.
Yet the effect is standardized flowers are given. Once giving flowers is the accepted, high-stakes sign of devotion, the sign can be readily faked by any person who knows the system's rules. This is exactly what teaching to the test does in education.
So when we teach to the test, we're essentially teaching students how to produce the standardized effect, the high score, without necessarily requiring them to internalize the desired cause.
The genuine transferable knowledge.
We are teaching the scoundrel how to buy the flowers.
That is the logical conclusion. The student who achieves a high score through intense rote memorization, aggressive rehearsal, and test-taking tricks, they exhibit the same effect, the high score, as the student who genuinely mastered the material through deep contextual learning. The standardized metric cannot tell the difference.
Wow.
And this is the fundamental logical error we have to confront. The attempt to quantify complex human qualities like learning, critical thinking, intellectual aptitude into a single unidimensional quantity, a number or a grade.
A single dimension.
Quality exists on multiple dimensions: depth, nuance, creativity, application, but a single score is just one dimension.
So why is quantity always insufficient to capture quality?
Because quantity, by definition, is almost always a very small aspect of quality. You can quantify the number of words a student writes, but that tells you nothing about the depth of their insight or the rhetorical beauty of their argument. Quantification simplifies the messy, multidimensional nature of learning into a single, easy-to-manage data point. The attempt to measure the non-observable, like true innate intelligence or moral character, leads to conclusions that one researcher described as often being vain and illusory.
So how do you separate the two?
The only way to genuinely separate true aptitude, the cause, from successful rehearsal, the fake effect, is to appeal to non-standardized factors. Context, spontaneity, consistency over time, or performance in unique situations where preparation is impossible.
Which is everything a standardized test is designed to eliminate.
By their very nature, they suppress these critical, non-standardizable factors in favor of efficiency.
Okay, so if the current system is ethically flawed, imposes this huge emotional tax, and perpetuates a logical error by relying on a single high-stakes metric, then the path forward requires a complete philosophical shift in how we approach evaluation.
It does.
Assessment has to be viewed first and foremost as a tool for promoting student learning and growth, not simply as a means of ranking and sorting and punishing students or schools.
We need to fundamentally shift towards multi-source, multi-method assessment approaches. That's the only way to provide a more comprehensive, fair, and nuanced picture of student abilities. This isn't just about making tests nicer. It's about honoring the complexity of human learning and ensuring validity.
So what's required are alternatives that demand a demonstration of deeper understanding.
And practical transferable abilities rather than just recall. We need to move away from these low-stakes, low-quality assessments.
Okay, so give us some concrete examples of these multi-method approaches that could achieve that ethical goal.
Certainly, we can look at things like portfolios, which collect a range of student work drafts, reflections, final pieces over time. They showcase progress and consistency, not just a single snapshot.
Right.
We need performance-based assessments, which require students to apply knowledge and skills to simulated or real-world tasks, like conducting a lab experiment or designing a marketing campaign. We also need more open-ended questions in large-scale projects or exhibitions where students have to defend their work orally.
And these methods are inherently more aligned with educational equity then?
They are, because they support what's called culturally responsive pedagogy. They utilize students' prior experiences and their frames of reference. They maximize educational potential instead of punishing cultural difference. A student who has unique insights into community organizing can apply those insights to a project, whereas a multiple-choice test might dismiss them entirely.
And the push to modernize assessment is also being driven by these pedagogical and technological movements that are designed to increase access and equity. I'm thinking of the movement towards Universal Design for Learning, or UDL.
UDL is key here.
Because UDL requires educators to design alternative, flexible ways for students to demonstrate their learning. So instead of relying solely on the traditional text-based essay or a multiple-choice test, we should be positioning students as creators and innovators.
And we're seeing this implemented successfully in places like STEM makerspaces, where students act as ideators and prototypers. They apply mathematical and scientific knowledge to design solutions that benefit their community.
That's a great example.
And this shift is particularly powerful for supporting neurodivergent students, ensuring equity and expanding authentic expression. I mean, if a student can build a robot that solves a specific problem, their learning is demonstrated, regardless of what their standardized test score says.
Okay, and what about the elephant in the classroom? Artificial intelligence. How do we approach that ethically, given that AI can instantly produce the desired effect, the high-quality paper, without the student necessarily producing the cause.
AI integration must be approached with integrity and a really strong ethical compass. We have to teach AI fluency, recognizing AI as a powerful tool to enhance productivity, for brainstorming, for proofreading, checking grammar, formatting. But it cannot be a replacement for higher order thinking or for completing the entire core project.
So where's the line?
Using AI to write an entire paper is clearly unethical, as it substitutes the machine's thought process for the students. The ethical solution is to design assessments that AI cannot complete successfully, assessments that demand specific, unique context or real-time oral defense. We have to assess the process of learning, not just the final product.
Finally, to truly ensure fairness and equity, we have to address the professional capacity of educators themselves in navigating these local dilemmas.
Absolutely. We need to improve professional ethics training for educators, specifically regarding their day-to-day local assessment and grading practices. And what's interesting is there's actually high agreement among teachers that using multiple types of assessments and clearly communicating how grades are calculated beforehand are essential ethical practices.
They know what they should be doing.
They know.
But wait, if they agree on the principle, why do they still often fall back on one or two high-stakes tests for grading?
Because agreement on principle is very different from consensus on practice when the stakes are high. When researchers presented educators with these tricky assessment scenarios like basing a final grade solely on 2 multiple-choice tests, or whether it is ethical to remind a student who is incorrectly bubbling an answer sheet, the educators often disagreed sharply on whether these actions were ethical or unethical.
Ah, so there's ambiguity.
That ambiguity is exactly why a key recommendation is scenario-based professional development. Simply providing a laundry list of do's and don'ts isn't enough. We have to improve educators' judgment in navigating these complex, ambiguous assessment dilemmas. That's what reduces ambiguity, prevents unfair or unjust grading, and ultimately protects the student.
That was a tremendous deep dive into the ethical contradictions and the measurement problems inherent in standardized testing. To recap, from the student perspective, we saw the profound anxiety, the motivational harm, and that feeling of inadequacy caused by these opaque processes and shifting expectations. From the professional perspective, we discussed the ethical squeeze on teachers, which leads to that narrow defensive instruction and the pressure cooker environment that can encourage practices like assisted cheating.
And from the systemic and philosophical perspective, we really tackled the core issues of cultural capital, social stratification, and the fundamental problem of measurement validity. We showed that quantifying complex human qualities into a single number often makes the conclusion vain and illusory.
Right, because the score only captures the effect.
And not the true underlying cause. The critical takeaway here is that accountability is necessary for public education, but the current inappropriate reliance on single high-stakes standardized tests actively impedes student learning and compromises ethical professional practice.
So what's the obligation?
Our obligation must be to follow the core professional principle of do no harm. And this requires us to continuously and critically examine the consequences of testing practices for all who are affected: students, teachers, communities. Not just for the authorities who demand the data. We have to strive for assessment systems that genuinely promote equitable opportunity and educational progress.
Absolutely. And thinking back to that philosophical critique, the idea that standardized testing reveals only the capacity to produce a desired effect, a high score, and not the underlying cause, which is true intelligence or integrity, it prompts a final provocative thought for you to carry into your own life. Since the fake sign can always look the same as the true sign and a standardized metric can be gained, what non-standardizable factors like spontaneous responses, consistency and effort over a long period of time, or decisive actions taken in unique, completely unprepared situations should you look for when evaluating the true capabilities and integrity of those around you and even yourself? That's what's truly worth measuring.